To move out of the urban and into the rural, I'm going to look at this a little bit differently, and in contrast to the abstract through two different case studies. So, I mean, I'll be talking a little bit more around rural land activation via Indigenous agriculture, and in this case, through a native grasses for grains strategy, but I do want to acknowledge that Indigenous agriculture is defined by Indigenous peoples. So that can mean different types of land activation. That can mean cotton farming and other types of agriculture as well, run by Indigenous communities. So that an Indigenous agriculture based on native plants has the potential to link multiple aspects. So caring for country, health and well-being, cultural identity, knowledge generation and transmission, as well as, and at the end of the priority list, really in some ways, but at the top of the priority list in other ways, income and jobs. So first I will discuss so moving out of Sydney, and you would have seen Nama's map there where Narrabri links up with Bathurst Local Aboriginal Land Local Aboriginal Land Council. And I'm just going to discuss quickly some insights that we gathered through a case study evaluation that sort of helps characterize rural local Aboriginal land councils. So this was based on 3 different land councils, so Mudgee, Orange and Bathurst Local Aboriginal Land Councils, and then an arm of Bathurst Local Aboriginal Land Council, which sits in Lithgow, which is the Mingan Wiradjuri Aboriginal Corporation, who have cultural right and authority over managing Aboriginal places and lands in the Lithgow area. So we did a research program through local land services so that they could evaluate their engagement with these local Aboriginal land councils. But as part of that, we really wanted to understand the land councils, what resources were there, where there were gaps, and what the land council's aspirations were. So funding and staffing is a really big issue for rural land councils, with most funding still reliant on top-down funding that comes through, which means that full-time equivalent workers, there might be 1 to 2. In most places, at least 1, sometimes 2 full-time equivalent staff. So there's a huge volunteerism that's linked into rural local Aboriginal Land Council work. Rural local Aboriginal Land Councils are therefore spread super thin, and they really handle most cultural related issues, being the peak body. So that includes cultural land management of Aboriginal places, as well as just looking after those places, especially because they're often places that get, in the words of elders, trashed regularly by tourists and locals. So there's a lot of work just cleaning up those places, let alone maintaining through cultural land practices. They also look after cultural assessments for developments that might occur, as well as cultural awareness training, and doing welcomes for countries and things like that. LALCs also largely handle language maintenance. They also look after issues related to health, education, housing, social services. They're fighting development. So much time is spent, putting in native title claims and fighting them. They're doing a lot of different jobs with very limited resources. And this is a quote here from the Bathurst Local Aboriginal Land Council. At the moment, Waa LALC is a massive project because with the limited resources and everything, it's mainly just focused on the community and Waa LALC, and that pretty much takes up all our time. The thing is, the Land Council doesn't want to put our fingers in too many pots and then not be able to manage. So the few that we do have, we give it everything. And if you are not familiar, Waa is the true name of Mount Panorama, which was awarded, which was given back to community through native title, in this case, through a 20-year-long battle for that. There are also, as I mentioned, resource gaps, and a quote here again from Bathurst Local Aboriginal Land Council. So that was the biggest hurdle, finding someone who's good at grant writing to put in for funding, and that applies to everything really. If you want to branch out, you need someone proficient in grant writing, and that has to be their job and their only job. So there's a lack of key positions, a lack of understanding where the funding opportunities and pathways, having the capacity to have someone in that position to actually find the funding opportunities and pathways and then to actually pursue them. And then including skilled workers, long-term positions, a lack of infrastructure as well as agency coordination. And I don't mean to be speaking so much in a deficit language, but these are the words of the CEOs and the staff at local Aboriginal land councils. And so self-sufficiency is a really key aspiration. So these are a few quotes. In the end, once the funding's there and everyone is able to go through everything, there's no reason why in 5 to 8 years that the community couldn't be self-sufficient. So that's from the Mingan Wiradjuri Aboriginal Corporation, and from Orange Local Aboriginal Land Council. We can't depend on funding forever. You've got to be sustainable. But to get to this stage takes a fair bit of work. And then the final quote from them, I guess the biggest stumbling block for all of that is the capital. We've got the land, we have the expertise, we've got the guys in the community who have been trained up and could slip into those positions. It's about creating the opportunity for that. And so this brings me to discussing the land that has been given back. So in rural areas, often the land that has been given back, the Crown land that has been given back, is the more marginal and in Western terms, less productive land, which is usually very expensive and very much dominated by white farmers. And then there are a lot of co-managed places, Aboriginal places as well, reserves and other such places, but there's limited activity that the community can have on those places. There are also a number of bequeathments that have happened in rural Australia. So some of that farmland that good farmland, that productive farmland is starting to open up, but mainly through bequeathments. So not Crown land, very much private land. Okay, so now I'm going to move a bit further north, and I'll show you a map of that in a second. So I'm going to look at this issue through the Indigenous Grasslands for Grains project that we've been running here at Sydney Uni for the last 5 years. It's based in the School of Life and Environmental Sciences because our Narrabri farm is based in that school and the science faculty, but it really branches out into multiple areas, into health, into archaeology. It's a very transdisciplinary project. And some of the key projects that we've done through this are related to one, DigiFarm, which is all about actually growing native grasses on the property to start developing some of that science around management. A paddock to plate project, which looked at the potential for growing the grains all the way over to the consumption side of things. Threshing to look at how you actually get the seed out of the gloom. And that's a project in collaboration with Black Duck Foods, which is Bruce Pascoe's company. And then we also have 2 current initiatives, or 2 big bids at the moment, for a native grains processor, as well as a native grains knowledge sharing hub. And so there is a lot happening in this space, but I suppose the biggest strength of this project so far has been the authentic engagement that we have had with communities. And so some of our key partners are Waa LALC, Black Duck Foods, as I mentioned, as well as Waa LALC, Narrabri LALC, and 10 other LALCs in the Gamilaré country. So Waa LALC is a key partner because they run some specific programs that are very in collaboration with community to meet community needs around conservation, heritage assessments. And so they are a key partner because they're very embedded in the community. And so the way that this project has developed has very much been through dialogue, conversation, workshops. And at most of those workshops, there is a bread making and bread eating sort of thing that we do as part of that. So a different sort of type of methodology where you're actually working with native grains and trying the bread. But everyone is sort of sharing knowledge together, and that's been that slow, gentle movement in northwestern New South Wales. So I should mention that the key investigator for this is Dr. Angela Patterson, and she works alongside Auntie Kerry Saunders, who has her own business, her own cultural tourism business in Moree, but the 2 of them have very much been doing the type of engagement where you go to different communities and start talking about grains and start cooking them. And this has really seen a sharing of knowledge. So this is a map just showing where Waa and Narrabri are in relation to Sydney. And to go into some of those land councils now to have a look at what resources they have and how they've engaged with the project. Every local Aboriginal land council has expressed a different motivation and a different reason as to why they might be interested in pursuing a native grains enterprise. So Waa Local Aboriginal Land Council, they have some access to land. So they have access to an Aboriginal place, so Tulladunnah Reserve, which is also a massacre site. And they were bequeathed land in town where they, in the last year, built a cultural centre. So their access to land is quite limited still. And that's reflected in their comments. So they define themselves as the poor local Aboriginal land council on Gamilaré country. And they say, we are restricted, honestly, because we're so isolated. Only one person works here, everyone else volunteers. And so we continue our arts and cultures, and we're going to have workshops and stuff like that will create some income. It will have a fully functioning kitchen, so we hope to do native foods and stuff out of there. So Waa LALC were very much focused on participating in the native grains project through a more tourism focused and cultural awareness focused enterprise. So they really wanted to do the small scale stuff like harvesting native grains or native grasses on Tulladunnah Reserve, and then using that as part of their cultural workshops. They weren't interested in pursuing anything more commercial unless they could partner with what they termed the rich LALCs who were next door. And this is some of the different days that we had with Waa LALC. And this is another quote. So we're looking for that sort of knowledge. We're also looking at what you guys think of the native grasses for grains industry, or whether you think that's one thing and there are other foods that should be looked at. and how we could help with that locally. Maybe with the land councils in the area to develop some of the science behind it and then start a baby industry. So they were very much focused on partnering with other land councils to reinforce what they could do in this space. So the other land council is Narrabri Local Aboriginal Land Council. And in this picture, we have Auntie Lynn Trindle, who's the CEO of the land council, as well as Wendy Laird, whose family are part of the Laird Forest, if you know about the coal seam gas fights up in that part of the world. And Narrabri Local Aboriginal Land Council have significantly more land available to them in comparison to Waa Local Aboriginal Land Council. So Narrabri has a number of parcels of land in town, including land that they have set aside for different types of housing. So those plans are in process. There are other parcels like this one here, the top photo, where Lynn is showing us a Aboriginal burial site. And she talked about how much work the Land Council has to do to look after this site because it's right next to a football field. And so, you know, they've put up maybe 7 or 8 different types of gates with different types of locks to try and keep people out. And somehow every time there's a big football match, it ends up getting trashed because it's the place that people go to sort of celebrate after the match. And they've been successful with repatriation of bones of Gamilarate elders and ancestors into this place. So it's a really, really special and significant space. So there are those parcels of land in town, but there are also parcels of land along the highway that Narrabri LALC owns. And so they have big plans to put in a hotel, a bush foods restaurant, and they see participation in Indigenous agriculture or taking on a grasslands for grains type agriculture as fitting in with those bigger commercial aspirations. So this piece of land at the bottom there is a piece of land that they currently rent out for cattle adjustment to make some cash. But it's somewhere that Lynn says that the community has talked about having a native foods garden, or not just native foods, all foods garden, and that actually grasslands for grains they could start to do some trials on that land. But they were really keen, as that quote says, so we want a community garden, but we have no water here, but we'd be willing to trial some things maybe with grazing. But this community, Narrabri Local Aboriginal Land Council, is absolutely dominated by women and their volunteer base is a strong group of 40+ women who regularly they were very much focused on embedding grasslands for grains into education. So, you know, there's a quote here, you should grow them at the school, get the kids into it. You could go into all the different subjects. You could embed it throughout. And then they could see the potential to see that I could be this type of farmer. So that was a key motivation. If we can get our kids interested in native plants again, that's the reason they wanted to partner with our project. So there was this overwhelming understanding that there could be some cooperation between the land councils. I'll try and go a little faster. Sorry, guys. And really the potential, the feasibility of this isn't a native grains industry. There is a big native seeds industry. And currently, you know, a lot of native seed is a couple of $100 for a kilo. So it's worth a lot. And it's mainly used for, you know, mining, rehab and regeneration. So the enterprise could start along that sort of value chain. And the knowledge is there's always a lot of talk, well, there's no, you know, in non-Indigenous circles, you know, that the knowledge has been lost. But in fact, it's just been fragmented. So bringing people together creates this dialogue, and a few of our workshops now have brought people together that have, you know, one person's mentioned a patch somewhere and someone else has said, oh, yeah, my grandma talked about that patch. And then there's been a real sharing of knowledge and stories and a revitalization of that knowledge around native grains. There are different community aspirations, as I said. So when it comes to the cultivation of native grasses and what that might look like, and whether plant breeding should be a part of that mix, some Indigenous community members said, yes, we should go down this path. Other community members from different communities were more, you know, I think we should try and bring back the ecosystem and then harvest from that. Others were more like, let's try and do a monoculture and see what we can do that way. And plant breeding, should we make the grains bigger or smaller, or keep them small, is another factor because these grasses are so low yielding. And there's also a lot of talk from the local Aboriginal land councils around then creating an Aboriginal value chain. So there was a lot of talk around, you know, who would then process it. We don't just want to give our foods away to white processors who then, you know, make the most of the money along that value chain with, you know, the producers and harvesters making the least. And linked to that, which I'll just go to the last point, is consumption. So there was a lot of talk around, well, who can then afford to eat these grains at the other end if we put a premium on these products on our community to be able to access eating these grains. So there are questions there. But also in this type of industry, questions around how you protect cultural provenance and using provenance as a vehicle to protect Indigenous cultural intellectual property, as well as a certification model, which Black Duck Foods is currently pursuing pretty vigorously. And in Gamilaraay country, this would mean using language and perhaps trademarking language. So Dunbar means the grass seed, Dunbarbilla means a grassland, and Duwar means the bread that you make from the grass seeds. And I'll just keep going on, but these are just some quotes that exemplify some of those points I just made. You've got to know that interconnectedness of everything that goes into one piece of food. That'll tell you who the mob is, that'll tell you the country, that'll tell you the language, so it can all speak for itself. And a quote here from Bruce on, he argues that we shouldn't be using plant breeding. So he says, we don't want a new plant, we want our own plant, we want the plant that's good for country. And a quote here from Auntie Rhonda Ashby, saying, we want the employment, we want the recognition. There's a lot of goodwill in the non-Indigenous community, but it often doesn't translate into money for us or employment, so we have to insist on it. And this, I'll just try and finish up quickly, but now we're looking at cooperative, just activating Aboriginal owned land and co-managed land, but also activating land on private property. So regenerative farmers, part of their model is to bring back native grasses. So there could be cooperative models that link in there. Cotton farmers often use the best land and leave their more marginal pieces. So there's talk about, could that be part of a native grasses enterprise? And then as well as activating public land or crown land as well. And there's a lot of talk at the moment around travelling stock routes. There are 5,500 Aboriginal land claims as of 2017. I couldn't get a more updated figure, which means that approximately 50% of the travelling stock routes are currently under land claims. And so there's a lot of questions there around how could you open up these places, because travelling stock routes, railways are usually where the best remnant grasslands, the best remnants of grasslands still exist in country. And so Black Duck Foods, Deep High, they are currently looking at this and how they could open up these types of crown land to benefit and be part of Indigenous enterprise. And I'll end there so that I don't go too much further. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Nama and Beck. That was a really great pair of complimentary presentations. As Beck mentioned, there's running a bit over time nearly, but if there's any questions, people can stick up a hand or just unmute and pitch in. Would be totally welcome.
May I ask a question? So thank you both. Very interesting. Nama, may I ask a question? It's really about the geographical map that you presented right at the beginning of your talk. And forgive me for sort of asking a question about something that's tangential, but as a geographer who loves maps, I couldn't help but sort of see how that's so spatially variable. And obviously you provided an insight into why there might be such spatial variability across states and territories. But can you offer any further insights? Do you see geographical misrepresentation or not variability in ways that can be explained by contemporary policy? Or is that map likely to change in the future?
Thanks, Dale. I assume you refer to the map of the Indigenous estate in Australia?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Explaining the variabilities is very complicated. I can say that each of the states and territories of Australia has its own history of Indigenous land rights. So, you know, I think we could say interesting things about the land rights system in Northern Territory, which is a pioneer system in Australia, for instance, and how that evolved. And then we can talk about Queensland. One of the, I guess, from a historical geographical perspective, one of the things that potentially explains the variability is the evolution of settlement. So there is a very significant difference between the southern parts of Australia to the northern part of Australia due to the way that settlers settled the land and due to the, I guess, the demography of genocide that happened in those areas, etc. So there are specific histories here involved. In the New South Wales context, you know, it's probably one of the most displaced and dislocated and dispossessed Aboriginal populations in Australia because of early colonization. And so I think when we talk about the 1983 Act, it was in some ways a response to an acknowledgement that Aboriginal communities in New South Wales have been tremendously displaced. And so trying to respond ethically and politically to that displacement and dispossession by using exclusively pre-colonial or pre-contact cultural and territorial arrangements, it's probably not going to work. So in some ways, it was a very progressive legislation to its time, but thinking, you know, but native title was a later legislation. So yeah, an interesting evolution, but a long conversation.
Thank you. I realize that, but I appreciate the sort of further ideas. Thank you.
Yeah. I think Joe is.
Yeah, Joe.
Thank you both for a very interesting talk. So many fascinating issues there. I just want to pick up, I guess it's an extension of Dale's point. I think that, Nama, you referenced this, that when we look at this spatially and we look at these maps, there is what we are seeing, I think, and I think it's arguable, and Nama, I think you picked this up, is a difference between the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Rights Act of 83 and then the Native Title Act, okay, the decade later in 93. And really critically importantly, and you've both spoken to this around the edges, is that this is an issue of how we define property under those two acts, one being state, one being Commonwealth, and the implications that has for how Aboriginal groups can then, if you like, engage in a commercialisation enterprise and enable themselves in that sense. So this goes to the very definition of property that are enabled under those two legislative regimes, which are very different and have very different historical bases. And I think it's really interesting to compare and contrast the two scenarios that you've got here when we think about that legislation which enables these things to take place. Anyway, that's what I think. So that's quite interesting, I think, from that point of view. But it was interesting. I mean, I think that if we spatialize this, that's what we can actually pull apart. It's very clear to me that we're talking about two different pieces of legislation. And in some senses, NAMA's group and material goes to the New South Wales legislation, and Rebecca's comments around there being restrictions on commercialisation opportunities is all to do with the fact that there is more native title classifications in rural communities and less under the New South Wales legislation. Anyway, they're just ideas and thoughts. Do either of you have any comments on that?
Beck, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I guess I definitely, Joe, they're very different legislations, and the way that they've been rolled out has created some really huge rifts in community, especially where local Aboriginal land councils are not, you know, in some cases versus those that are claiming native title who sit outside of local Aboriginal land councils who can claim continuous occupation of land. And it's really caused some huge fragments, but some huge rifts between families and between communities that have just sort of expanded in this ripple effect and resulted in all these other conflicts in other ways, which are myriad ways, but I'll hand over to Nama as well.
Yeah, look, I think definitely the question of property is crucial. Like, it's core to this conversation, right? It's also core to how much the New South Wales government is even interested in intervening. Because if you think about the kind of landscape, the kind of political landscape that that an organization like Narrabri has to deal with, versus you know, when Beck and I were preparing this, Beck was saying, well, in my case, all these LALCs are keen for government to say something, but they're completely neglected. Like, nobody even talks to them. In my case, Narrabri's experiencing over intervention, and, like, you know, there's like meetings, 5-6 meetings a week with New South Wales government because of the kind of property arrangements and question of commodification of land and things like that that are so significant in the urban, or that I guess explain much of the urban to rural divide. But I think one other thing that, in my opinion, is significant here is, well, first of all, you know, these rifts and these frictions, they exist in the city as well, right? Like, Durban has a whole set of problems due to the whole, the Darug people's recognition and what that means for their land, and, you know, can Darug claim native title, and what would it do if they did in Western Sydney? Like, you know, these things have urban expressions, if you will. But I think because it's so difficult to get native title in the city, it's near impossible, really, that it manifests very differently, right? Like, the outcomes are very, very different. But in that sense, you know, what Rebecca, and I just read Kurt's comment, but what Rebecca referred to as this, like, LALCs having this tremendous challenge with cash flow, essentially, is what they're saying, is very true for Narrabri as well. The reason why Narrabri is pushing these massive developments forward is because of cash flow. They're trying to generate money to bring back into projects like housing and things that are not cash revenue, or they're not revenue projects, right? So that's where having so much land, and very expensive land, comes in handy, because you can create developments to offset your own, you know, community enterprise, where in rural areas it's not as available. But the problems of cash flows and staffing and things like that, they're very similar. Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for that one. If are there any other questions from those from Annie? I recognize we've gone a few minutes over time, so Bob, you got your hand up.
Oh, that was a really great, two great presentations, so thank you. But one thing I was interested in when we were talking about the land claims and so on is actually the formation of yet another form a special Aboriginal organisation in New South Wales in '83. Because in the late 1970s, the Commonwealth government under Fraser passed an act called the Aboriginal Councils and Associations Act. I had the experience of actually working in New South Wales, the New South Wales office of the Commonwealth Department, sort of in that period. And I always remember one of the fundamental argument behind it, the official argument behind it was it simplified organisation for Aboriginals who wanted to be engaged in financial activities and so on. But the counter argument is it did the opposite, that actually made them more responsible to the government. So how does this kind of relate to what you see happening in these LALCs? Sorry, I hope that's a useful question. I'm not sure.
Beck?
Yeah, sure. I suppose it had, again, it's led to some conflicts. In some cases, you know, I definitely know that sometimes, you know, a whole family has sort of run the local Aboriginal Land Council, and that has meant that others have been sitting outside of that. So there's been this talk around, well, that's a government construct. We don't adhere to that. We adhere to community protocol, community constructs. And so there's definitely some tension between that as a government construct speaking up and being able to manage that land and hold that land, versus other families that feel they have a claim to the local Aboriginal Land Council and to run that as well, or to have access to that land as well for commercial purposes. Yeah, Nama?
Look, my only comment is to say that any legislation in Australia is a colonial legislation, and it forces Aboriginal communities into particular frameworks that I don't actually know how resembling they are of what existed here before white people arrived. Like I don't know, you know, and I think it's not my place to comment on it. So my only, and I think Darabin fully understands that, my only saying here is that Darabin's fully aware of the fact that the Land Rights Act is a colonial one, and it puts them in a particular relationship with government, and the decision to engage is constrained but also enabled by that relationship. So native title is exactly the same. This is not somehow a reversal of colonization. This is a reflection of the evolution of colonial relations. So that's just the way it is, you know. And yeah, it is the decision to engage, and it creates a whole set of problems and frictions, and yeah, but the alternative is not to engage, which, you know, some Aboriginal people do, but they're the minority for a very clear reason. The government has the money and the resources. So if you want to change something, you need to engage. Yeah.
Thanks, Dal. Kurt has posted a question in the chat. If you can answer that in like a minute or two, maybe you could cover it now. But it's a bit of a maybe complex one on that.
Yeah, it might be too long. I guess it just did strike me. I just would be so interested to know how you're both seeing your own projects differently, having had this dialogue. Like, it's so interesting to have them put together. And so, yeah, that might be a chat for a pub afternoon when we can have one rather than for right now.
I mean, yeah, I know. I think honestly, this is just from my perspective, there's way more to engage with here. Like, you know, I would want to see this conversation, I guess, enhanced in a way, because I think there is a lot of learning to be done. And I do think, as academics love to say, there's a paper here, but that's, you know, yeah, look, I think it's a fruitful angle to think about land rights in those sort of classic geographical terms. Very much so, yeah. I don't know what that means, but I do think it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it's fascinating the difference in opportunities as well. So the opportunities that D. Robin are sort of pursuing in terms of the enterprises that they're pursuing and at the scale that they're pursuing. Yeah, I mean, it's just very different to the rural local Aboriginal land councils, who very much, in a lot of ways, are not as, I mean, I'm not going to umbrella it, but many are not as political. They see their role as a community maintenance, you know, as a one-stop shop for community rather than as a advocate as such going back up through the government on communities. So I think all local Aboriginal land councils are just really different is really what the takeaway.
Yeah, thanks. I think definitely a fruitful bed for further conversation in a pub at some point. Yeah, I think that as it's 12 past, we can probably wrap it up there. So yeah, thanks a lot, Nama and Beck. That's fantastic.